Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and we are here for another episode of The Sound of Economics. This time, I'm pleased to have Bruegel Deputy Director Maria Demertzis. Hi Maria, how are you?
Hi Giuseppe.
And Nicola Viegi, Professor of Monetary Economics at the University of Pretoria, who joins us from South Africa. Hi Nicola, how is it going over there?
It's fine. We are going into the summer, for it's warm. It's nice.
And when it comes to the pandemic, are you in lockdown?
No, we are not in lockdown. The situation now, because we are going into the summer, actually is quite under control up to now. But we are watching Europe with a bit of trepidation because it's going to come soon.
Yeah, and speaking about the trepidation that we are living here in Europe and in many other regions of the world about the pandemic, today's theme that we will explore is the one of uncertainty. Uncertainty that is very evident with what is going on with COVID-19, especially the impact that such an uncertainty has in planning policy interventions, especially monetary policy, in such a climate. Maria specifically has just published a paper for the European Parliament on the topic, looking especially at the challenges faced by the European Central Bank. And I will drop the link for our listeners in the show notes for them to have a look at the paper. And Nicola is an expert on economic policy under uncertainty, and it will be extremely interesting to hear from his observatory in South Africa for both a specific view from that region as well as helping us in a global reflection. But before we dive deep with both of you into this discussion, let me introduce some key facts around the issue. To give you an idea of the entity of the uncertainty we are in, only in the euro area, the forecast is that the economy will contract by 8.7% in 2020 and grow by 7.1% in 2021. The drop in GDP in 2009, which was the worst year of the financial crisis, was just over 5%. So there is no doubt that the drop we face today is much more significant, although it is expected to be short-lived and with a sharp bounce back. However, all EU countries are currently going through a COVID-19 second wave, as we just mentioned, which is kind of worse than the first wave in terms of number of infections. And countries, one after the other, are applying partial shutdowns to contain the spread of the virus. And we are still in this moment in the uncertainty because we don't know what is going to be the real hit to the economy of all this and how long it will be before we can resume normality, or even what is normality or what is going to be normality. Those are all kind of questions that floats in the air. Because this notion of a return to normality masks the fact that major shifts were already taking place in the global economy before the outbreak of the COVID-19. We saw the issue of digitization, globalization, and its possible reversal, and shifting powers across the globe that all pointed to a transition underway, which is pointing as well into the direction of uncertainty. So we are going to discuss all these aspects, but first starting with the main question related to the pandemic and the immediate uncertainty we are living in. And I look at Maria because you've been looking into all of this in this recent study I was mentioning before. Maybe you can help me and our listeners to understand better the dilemma we are in.
Yeah, thanks very much, Giuseppe. I think you've given us a lot of information. I mean, as a testament to the uncertainty, even the numbers that we use in the paper and you've quoted are actually changing. And I think one of the most important things to understand is that, while we're, just a few weeks ago, we were thinking that, we will be able to have what we call now a V recovery, which is, a very big drop in GDP today, but hopefully a quick recovery immediately after that, namely in 2021. As more and more countries, certainly in Europe, are going into partial or even less partial shutdowns in different countries, the probability of this V-shaped recovery happening is actually diminishing. And, that's exactly what we mean by uncertainty. I think we need to start thinking, get into the right frame of mind where very little is known, even for things like tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And that's very much pandemic induced. So that's really the uncertainty that the pandemic has brought us. But as you said, that comes over and above some of the uncertainties that we were facing before the pandemic. And they are a lot more structural changes. Since we have Nicola here, we should try and ponder about these more structural uncertainties that we see more globally. For the moment, at least, and this is where the paper is going, the uncertainty that the ECB is facing as a result of the pandemic has to do with, how is it going to react to try and stimulate the economy? The ECB has done massive things to try and help the economy, very much in tandem with other players in the European Union, the countries themselves, but also, the European Commission, all the institutions have put gunpowder available to the deal with the pandemic. But the ECB has really done its part. And it has done its part, even though before the pandemic, we were all saying that it doesn't really have many more instruments to work with. Interest rates had already been extremely low, negative interest rates. The balance sheet of the central bank, what we call the unconventional tool of the ECB, had been expanded in measures that we had never seen before. And yet, here we are in, as you described, the biggest shock, possibly in a lifetime. And the ECB is really doing stuff. It's doing stuff to help. Now, what this means is that some of the possibly unintended consequences of the things that the ECB is doing, we don't know them yet, and they might materialize. It's important to think about this, and they might compromise the ability of the ECB to be able to do more things in the future. But I think what's crucial in all this discussion is to understand that when you are in fire, you've got to use all the water that you have. You don't spare some of the water in the event that you might get thirsty later on. No, you have to use all the water, and after that you will look for new water, as it were. So I think we are in that type of situation right now. It pays, however, to think a little bit about the future as well, because maybe it helps you, it guides you in today on how to adjust some of the things. We do have time to think about certain policies. We know a lot more today than we knew in the financial crisis. So use all of this to try and design policy. But I think the context of uncertainty will have to be really addressed, also in the context of reviewing the monetary policy strategy of the ECB, which is currently on its way. But also it will have to guide the small steps that the ECB will necessarily have to do to deal with the increasingly uncertain shock.
Yeah, Maria, I wanted to indeed reflect on this, because what you say about the European Central Bank, I say this also for our listeners that might not be too familiar with the European context, which might listen to us from other parts of the world. I'm pretty sure that similarly to the European Central Bank, as well, central banks all over the world have been facing similar problems, even if in very different context of the one of the European Central Bank, which is very specific and peculiar, of course, because the European Union is not a sovereign state, so it has its own specificity, which adds some level of complexity over there. And for this more like global overview, I definitely thinking about the fact that Nicola is connected from South Africa, and I would be really curious to hear from you, Nicola, if you are being observing a similar pattern of the one that Maria just mentioned in the context of the European Central Bank.
Very much so. In some sense, the background is similar, but the picture is much more striking, because the situation is in a lot of emerging countries is critical, and you don't have the same firepower, the same amount of water that the ECB or the European countries have. And when I talk about firepower, is economic firepower, the ability to mobilize a lot of resources, and is also institutional firepower. And that one is an important, I think, things also for Europe to think about, the institutional firepower, that is the stock of credibility that you can spend in moment of this critical nature. Therefore, in a lot of emerging countries, for example, confronted with the need of a huge fiscal expansion, simply to protect people during the lockdown, you are not in a condition that you can use this instrument freely. First, because your fiscal space is limited, and your ability to use also the monetary instrument to finance, if you want, this fiscal water, is very limited by the nature itself of an emerging country. Therefore, the way we operate critically is really that we have to think about what is the effect not only of the crisis on the economy, but really of how the response to the crisis will affect the future path of the economy. Therefore, if you want, there is a square uncertainty, an uncertainty over an uncertainty, because we don't know what the effect of the crisis is on the structure and how the crisis will reinforce negative trends that were coming before. And we don't know how the response, even necessary response to the crisis, will affect the ability in the future, and therefore the level of stock of credibility that we will have in the future. A lot of emerging countries, for example, are really have slowly try to find way if there is, a quantitative easy option in emerging countries. And what are the conditions that make this possible? And therefore, the very importance of maintaining sort of long-term anchor and to find institutional way. And therefore, there is some experimentation, but it's very, very limited. And this one then limits also the ability to respond to the crisis itself. And therefore, that, is all this uncertainty really make you think of, what are the ways in which we can communicate a commitment to long-term stability, while at the same time use the instrument that we have as much as possible now. And that is very much this night and uncertainty hysteresis, these two terms that were at the margin of economics for a long time, that become very much central in the policy making. Both is how shocks affect, the trend, how shocks affect the future of the economy, and how we deal with uncertainty. Therefore, how we deal with the fact that, we don't see clearly ahead. And therefore, we need to be prepared to change it, to adapt.
Perhaps you can tell us a little bit, Nicola, so for the benefit of our audience, how much has QE been used in the emerging world?
At the first, when the shock hit, in a lot of emerging countries, there was some buying of bonds, but mainly for liquidity reasons. Therefore, when the shock hit, what happened is that the bond market liquidity just dried up. And therefore, there was a very big need of intervention of the bank, both here, but everywhere. Chile, a lot of emerging countries, the central bank intervened and used the QE, mainly for liquidity reasons, to stabilize the market. Actually, the market stabilized even with a big fiscal shock. The market has stabilized quite remarkably. Therefore, we were quite worried that we would not be able, therefore we will have to use several rounds of QE, and therefore the risk that this one will pose to the credibility. Instead, the market has stabilized quite a lot, also because of the QE that has been done in Europe and in US, that therefore the bond market has not dried out, and we are living on a sort of a stable period. But there is always, this element of the possibility that another shock, will put us in another difficult condition is always there. Plus, there is the accumulation of debt. And that one is not going away. And therefore, South Africa will go around 100% of GDP of debt in a couple of years' time. And the problem is how we deal with that. In a situation in which we are not growing, in which the external conditions are not favorable, and therefore the potential pressure on monetary policy, the expectation of what monetary policy might be, is quite critical at this time.
You clearly pointed out that there is one shock and then there is potentially another shock and that might not be predictable and so on. Like that's the situation beside and beyond the pandemics. We've been saying this since the beginning of the episode. There is a structural world of uncertainty in which we are operating in, which is completely different, and which are the instruments that we need to use or adopt in this new world of uncertainty. And I'm again would like to ask Maria, because let's say the broader aspect of your study that you published for the European Parliament, touching not just, taking the example of COVID-19, but just as an example of the fact that we are witnessing a broader transformation which requires a new thinking. Perhaps we can dive a little bit more on that aspect.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think that's a very good point. And in fact, when I talk about COVID-19, I like to sort of talk about COVID-19 sort of accelerating some previous existing tendencies and possibly decelerating some. So what do I mean by that? I mean, I think there are really two big transformational shocks, if you might call it, if you like, two big transformations that have been going on for some time, and that will be affected somehow by COVID-19. The first one is digitization. I mean, I think, the digital shock where, everything is moving online and has been moving for some time. And, a lot of the services, a lot of the products that we consume are simply, behind a computer or behind some sort of an electric device. And that digitization and the connectivity that it necessarily implies is a big shock to the way that we think about economic growth. So that's one. And I actually believe, and it would be interesting to see what Nicola thinks, I think that COVID-19 simply accelerates that. We have to now sit behind the computer. So we have to rely a lot more on the services that are provided this way. And, I think that will accelerate it. And in fact, we've seen that even in our daily life, our events, the way that we do things is a lot more reliant on the computer because we can't go anywhere else. Some of it will not go away. At least not all of it will go away when we come back to the office. I think some of it will remain because it has some degrees of efficiencies and it has other advantages as well. So that's one. The second one is globalization and how the interconnectivity and how we operate with kind of integrated supply chains across the world. We have had tendencies of reversing this globalization. I've heard the term slowalization lately, which I think is actually probably a good way of describing this. Things will slow down. A few things were repatriated, and not just because the US is very antagonistic with the rest of the world and probably will stop being so, but because there is a tendency for sort of thinking that sort of reliance on very long integrated chains perhaps is not very resilient. The best example for that is pharmaceuticals, but not only. I mean, we see that actually there is a need to bring some of this production back at least closer to home so that we make it more resilient. I think there was a survey that was run at global CEOs, and the number one problem they were thinking about was exactly the length of the global value chains, how long these global value chains need to be for their production to be stable. So, we see globalization accelerating and we see probably globalization coming back. But I think what's interesting about both of them, and actually here Nicola and I are in the process of writing a paper about this, we're seeing that first of all, there are pressures on real interest rates that are secular and they're downward. What we observe over a period of 20 years is that the real interest rate, which is the price of investment, the cost of capital, main source of growth, that price is coming down and is becoming negative. We have to understand what that means. How can it be the real cost of capital, which is helping growth, is negative, right? And here is where I think uncertainty comes in. There are transformational issues for the economy that are worth sort of pondering about, the deep forces, and how we can reverse some of this, because obviously we cannot sustain a negative price of capital. I mean, that doesn't make sense.
Nicola, what's your take on this?
Because when we do these big scenarios, how the future is going to plan out. In reality, this one has very direct consequence of the way we think about monetary policy. Because, for example, this downward trend in the natural rate, and therefore this negative interest rate expected by the market for the next 10 years. It means, for example, for a country like South Africa, it means that the only game that you have is on the risk premium. The risk premium, and therefore the shocks will have a huge effect because the baseline is almost zero. Any movement, any change in expectation will have bubbling effect because there is very little, underlying growth to stabilize the trend. It means that if the natural rate is zero, it means that the instrument of monetary policy will be for the next 10 years quantitative instruments. How this will affect how monetary policy transmitted not only in Europe but in the rest of the world, we don't know, because even our models don't have enough data really to understand what is the long-term effect of having this kind of normal situation. Therefore, in some sense, is it reinforces this element of uncertainty because we can imagine, and therefore we try to understand in which direction the world is going to go. Globalization is expanding, is decreasing. Digitalization, is this producing more innovation or producing more concentration, therefore reduction the potential of growth. In this space of imagination, we still have to do policy. We still have to think how we stabilize the economy. We still have to think about how we use our instrument. And therefore, it requires a change of how really we think about policy, how we communicate it, how we design it, how even we talk. Therefore, the old idea of policy rules, I think in some sense they're gone because the policy rule require a stable underlying structure that allow you to calculate, not consistent behavior. What instead in this new world, the policy will be reactive. When you see the road, because you cannot see very far, you need to be able to react. Therefore, you have to be discretionary, but you need to build up some long-term anchor of credibility, institution, and long-term objective that people believe that allow you to be reactive to situation because we don't know what the situation is.
Just to say, Nicola, thanks for bringing in the issue of policy, because this was going to be my subsequent theme and question to both of you. So you anticipated the theme, and also because we are going towards the end of this episode as well. Indeed, I was looking at Maria because in her paper, she has a conclusion which is all about communication and all about policy, which I liked it very much. I would like just to quote this sentence and then ask her to build up and tell us a little bit more about it, where she says that communication around policy is going to be less about what will happen, which by definition is going to be less known, and more about what the reaction should be if alternative scenarios would happen. To me, it's pretty clear, but I think that this reveals quite a lot of the approach that you would like to propose to the question that Nicola was just asking to us.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, if I may reiterate, I think what Nicola described is exactly right, in the sense that, when you design policy, the big assumption is that you understand where you're going. Right. I mean, you understand that, the end destination is known. So we know how the economy operates, and, something happens, it moves us a little bit away from that position. What we do is we change policy instruments to get us back to this very well-known position that we have. What I've been trying to say is that actually the destination is very much unknown. Right? Imagine that you are traveling with a plane from London and you don't know where you're going. I mean, how can you adjust for winds when you don't know the destination, right? Sometimes I don't know the destination, and then I'm being hit by winds, and then I also have to adjust. That's policy. Policy is the adjustment, but I also need to know the destination. So, it becomes, as Nicola said, you don't have visibility ahead of you. So every time the road appears in front of you, you adjust a little bit. Then you need to be flexible to be able to adjust for that. Now, I think the two things that are important in this context is that we need to get away from this idea that we can forecast. I mean, if you believe what we've just been arguing, this idea that I'm forecasting and therefore based on this forecast, then I take decisions, is very erroneous. And it's erroneous not because in the paper we show you we have done it very wrong in the past, but also because it gives you a very false sense of security, which is very dangerous. I think that's very dangerous. Okay, I've got a model, it's predicted this, that's where I'm going. Well, you can go wrong with confidence. And I think that's what's, it's an important thing to keep in mind. So, what matters in this respect is talk about the things you know more and talk about the things you don't know less. And if you don't know the future, then just don't talk about the future. Talk about how you learn, how you're going to use new information the moment it comes in. And then just anticipate that many different things could happen. And in communication, and that's the last part of this paper, the communication is about what I'm going to do if alternative things happen. So how do you prepare for alternative scenarios? I think that's the role of communication is very much about guiding, but you cannot guide about the future because you don't know it. You have to guide about what you can do as soon as you get new information about these things. precisely because monetary policy is actually very technical. It gives you a very good framework for doing that. But what I just described is true for any policy. It's dare I say, it's true for life as well. But I mean, I think, when I know, I'll do something. If I don't know, then I prepare myself for alternative scenarios, you see. And I think there are interesting theories that Nicola knows very well, have developed in the context of monetary policy. And they tell you, prepare for different events. And as soon as you learn something new, then you use that, of course, to inform policy decisions, but don't rely on the future to guide you in these policies.
This is all fascinating, and to a certain extent, you are proposing to move away from forecast and doing a more honest communication somehow, right? I mean, a more honest communication to the citizens, to the investors, to the markets from the policy institutions, rather than pretending that they are under control because they detain some sort of crystal ball of forecast which is not working anymore. Rather be clear and upfront about that, but show that they are ready to the markets, to the citizens, to the investors, and so on, showing them that they are actually prepared. They have backup solutions, they have contingency plans in case something happens on scenario 1, 2, or 3. And you name it. That's what I understand is your proposal, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really reluctant to use the word honest. I'm not suggesting that anybody has been dishonest. I think what's important is to understand that, our models are tools of thinking about the world, right? And I mean, we should use those. And what I'm saying is we should actually use more, because the different things could happen. Just use as many different frameworks of thinking about the future. But our ability to rely on any single one version of the future is really not all that good. So I'm saying, look, since you cannot forecast it, use your different tools. And I think Nicola here will have a lot to say to basically learn how to think about the future and learn how to prepare for the contingencies. So it's not that it's dishonest. You have to also understand that economists really like mathematical tools. And, to the point of, believing them. And I think here Nicola has a view, I'm sure. Can you believe models, Nicola?
I think that institutions have to be very careful not to give information out that are not credible. Therefore, the problem of doing the forecast, because when you do a forecast, it's also a communication tool. In the framework of monetary policy today, your forecast, your model, etc., these are communication tools. You say, I'm in control, I know where I'm going, this is what I'm going to do. Now we have 10 years maybe, in which these forecasts are always wrong, because the models, by definition, are, like you say in the paper, it's very nice that the model are written in a way that are mean reverting. Therefore, there is an equilibrium there. And therefore, they always fail because actually the underlying structure is changing. Therefore, the trend is changing, and therefore the model, by definition, cannot capture that. They are not written to do that. If you insist on communicating that way, you are reducing the credibility of your own. Therefore, you are not giving the right information. It's not a matter of, and sometimes you need actually to open the space to different possibilities. There is one example of this policy very obvious in Europe. The whatever it takes speech of Mario Draghi. There was a communication that says clearly a commitment to a solution, but not a commitment to an history. It's a commitment, it's a contingent commitment. Whatever happens, I will find the instrument to get me where I want to go. And that is a sort of the frame of mind also of the communication, the frame of mind of the importance, for example, credibility, institutional structure, that people can believe your ability to do whatever it takes. Therefore, that's what uncertainty requires. Uncertainty requires to move away at the idea that we present as an institution an image that everybody knows is not going to work because the model cannot work. Therefore, I use all the information available, and therefore new data. We need really actually to work a lot of all this data that these big companies, this digitization of the economy actually allow us to learn much more in real time where the economy is going. Therefore, there is a lot of nice research that we can do and nice work that we can do in the new data to understand how the economy, because the GDP, the quarterly data are not enough anymore in some sense. Therefore, there is a lot of interesting stuff happening in this area. But around this principle that the new normal is that change will be permanent. Therefore, we have to adapt to the fact that change will be permanent. Agree on what are the long-term objectives, or what are the anchor of the system, and then being adaptable, being as a policy, being able to respond to change, because even the concept of shock pass, but change is always there, and then you have to deal and understand where the economy is going, which direction are going. And I think the contribution of the paper from the point of view, they bring the night and uncertainty, the hysteresis at the center of policy debate that for a long time it was not there, and I think is a nice contribution, and then we will have to do some more work on that, I think.
Thank you, Nicola. We are really going to close this episode, even though the conversation could really last for much longer, and I would like to ask Maria for a final thought to conclude.
Let me reiterate what Nicola said. The shocks pass, but change remains. I think we need to start thinking of a permanent change and how do you adapt to that.
Great. And I have to say that I learned quite a lot from both of you today, and I hope that our listeners as well enjoyed this episode of The Sound of Economics. And this brings us to the end of this conversation. And I would like to remind that for more insights and research from our scholars, you can visit the General Bruegel website, www.bruegel.org, and that the link to the paper that we discussed today, authored by Maria Demertzis, our guest in the podcast today, and Marta Dominguez Jimenez. So until next time, bye-bye.